So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that will be something you all can see. So as Professor Kim was indicating, the title of my lecture is Choose Economic Freedom and Prosperity. That, of course, comes from the overall focus of the conference, Supercompensation, Restoring Global Prosperity and Freedom. And it's good to be back in Korea, although I'm not really in Korea. I'm in California, not too far away, but I'm there in spirit. So I want to first mention this, what I call the principles of economic freedom, which is sort of an introduction to this basic idea, and that is our policies should be predictable, so there's no surprises, predictable framework. It should be based on the rule of law as much as possible so that we can emphasize what the policy is into the future, not just the present. We should have incentives, so we have incentives for people to do the right thing, not the wrong thing. And strong incentives are important, and this comes from reliance on the market system for the most part, not entirely. But if it's not the market system, it's a clearly limited role for government. So government has to do the right things at the right times, and it makes all the difference in the world. Now, in the United States and in other countries, we've seen the shifts in these economic freedom principles. In the 60s and 70s, I know it's a long time ago, we were shifting away from these principles. Then the 80s and 90s, we went back towards them. In the 2000s, we veered away again. In the 2010s, there's still some veering away. We're not back yet, and I think this is a global situation, so it's very much apropos for my discussion today. What I'm going to focus on is first of three principles: fiscal reform, regulatory reform, and monetary reform. My focus is going to be much on monetary reform, but we can't talk about monetary reform without fiscal reform and regulatory reform. So I'm going to start with those two and just mention what they are. So some of this comes from the excellent work at the Heritage Foundation, which divvies up measures of economic freedom, and I'll call into three groups. One group is this focus on fiscal policy, the first three. The second group is the focus on good governance, and that's the second five. And then the last part, which was going to be monetary policy, I'll talk about at the end. So there's three parts that I've divided these very important principles up into. And these are principles that will apply to any economy at any point in time. And it's hard to do, it's hard to make it true in reality, but it's very important. So let me start with the fiscal side and just remind you, this is a picture of the debt in the United States as a fraction of GDP. It goes back to when I first started in government, 30% if you so, and it went up and up and up and up and up, and we have just a little bit of a down now, but it's a tremendous change in the focus of fiscal policy, which has been much less of a focus on the debt. This is just the United States, of course. Other countries, which I'll come to, have had similar patterns. What I think is important to note about monetary policy, but more important for fiscal policy, is that stimulus, although we think of it often as the answer, is not the answer. I've just completed a paper called The Effective Rescue Plans and the Need for Policies to Increase Economic Growth. I evaluated three different stimulus packages in the United States, two in 2020, one in 2021. And if you look carefully at the impact of these on the economies, they did not work. They didn't increase economic growth. And of course, there's still dispute about that, but to me, it's not a surprise whether you look at the two in 2020 or the one in 2021. This is not a partisan statement by any means. But the same conclusion was reached many years ago, 40 years ago, believe it or not. And we keep trying to do the same things. And yes, there's elements of debate, but they just don't really work very much. So I don't want to say too much more about fiscal policy, except our focus should be on reducing the debt and trying to get out of these stimulus packages as much as possible. So let me go on to the second issue, which is basically regulatory policy. This is a very interesting map of the world economy. And you see countries that are green are better off than countries that are red. In terms of economic policy, you can see there's quite a bit of variety around the world. And if you look closely, you see a green South Korea. And I think that's an important aspect here. It's a trend in the right direction, it seems to me. It's not always been this way, as I'll show you in a minute, but it's a trend in the right direction. There's even some dark greens. We have to look carefully to see what they are. but this is the way that I think that economics tells us we should be going. So keep this in mind. And I'll look at this next plot, which is pretty remarkable. This is a index based on the same factors that are built on that map. And you can see the United States has gone down since the late 2007 or 08. South Korea has gone up, and the world is just the average of all the countries. But you can see there's a change. I think it's a change for South Korea is the right direction. I wish we could do a little bit better job in the United States, but this is a fact which you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about this idea of regulation, regulatory reform, which a lot of these things are based on. So those are my first two categories, fiscal policy and regulatory policy. The third is monetary policy, which I'll focus most of my attention on today. Monetary reform is very important. That's really what I think we need to focus on in the world economy now. The Fed in the United States is given responsibility for monetary policy through our Constitution. We have a Federal Open Market Committee with members appointed by the President of the United States or district banks. And other central banks are the same way. I have a picture of 10 central bankers, Governor Rhee at the upper right part of the picture, and Jay Powell right below him. Christine Lagarde is up there. And so all these central banks need to take these into account, and sometimes they drift away. And there's critics like me that say, don't drift away, stick to the right policy. And I think in the last few years, they've drifted away. That's really one of the messages that I'm going to have today. So the policy is made by these people and people who work with them, and there's different degrees of constraints in different countries. Sometimes we think of rules or strategies, and this is a famous one, of course, the quantity equation. The license plate in the corner is actually a California license plate. It looks just like Milton Friedman's plates. In fact, they are Milton Friedman's plates, which was given to me after he died. But you can see what this tells you. If money growth is up and velocity is not up and GDP is not up, then the only answer is inflation is up. So we go from doubling the rate of growth of the money supply from 4 to 8. Other things stay the same. Eventually, you have an increase in inflation, and that's what's being shown here. So this is one of the oldest rules which is around, but it's been replaced, not completely, but to some extent by this rule, which is sometimes called the Taylor rule, which focuses not so much on the money supply, but on the interest rate. So if you look at the one that's circled in red, it says the interest rate, maybe the federal funds rate, the short-term interest rate, should equal the inflation rate. So it's really effectively the real interest rate, plus a half times the GDP gap and a half times the difference between the inflation rate and its target. In this case, the target is 2. And then there's 2 as a measure of the real interest rate. So 2 is really what the target has been for many years at the Fed and other central banks. Other central banks have focused on this. But we're way above 2. Inflation is 6, 7, 8% in the United States and high, as we'll see in other countries as well. So this suggests the interest rate should be higher as a result. And so we can go on. This is a picture of how this rule was not good in bad times. It was good in good times. It was on in good times. And you can see the late 80s and 90s. And then it drifted away in the late period. We drifted away at the period, and that performance did not too well. And so the actual line, the policy rate was way below in that particular period. And then many people began to grasp on this difference. This is a quote from Janet Yellen when she was over at the Fed. When the economy is weak, we encourage spending by investing by pushing interest rates lower. When the economy is threatening to push inflation down the road, we increase rates. And she compared that with the so-called Taylor rule, which I just showed you a minute ago. And then there's other examples of this. You can see in the discussion, Jay Powell is referring to it. Larry Kudlow is a commentator, and others. He's never seen so much focus on rules, but it didn't last because of COVID. And we need to take this into account when we evaluate monetary policy. So everything changed when COVID hit. And there's the picture. The unemployment rate skyrocketed in the United States, went way up to nearly 15%. It's come back down below 4%, as you can see, so there's been a recovery, but we're still in a danger area. If you look at the world economy, the same kind of thing has happened. Not exactly as bad as the United States, but this is where the world looked in 2019. Looks pretty good. No reds, no declines, growth all over the place. But then the pandemic hit. 2020, red and colors not so favorable, below zero, all over the place. And even China became light green. And then there was a recovery, which was good news. It affected every country in the same way, but we're on the way to a better performance if we play it right. And that's really what I want to focus on today. So if you now think about this situation, I showed you the unemployment rate going up and coming down. This is the inflation rate, just in the United States. And you can see it's increased quite a bit. It looks almost as bad as the 70s and 80s, but it's temporary in the sense it's not increased as much as fast, but it may last, and that's the danger. We need to address this issue. There's a headline, 8.5%, so just to remember that a lot of people are writing about this. It's not just charts. If you look at what's happened in the period since 2020, the Federal Reserve and other central banks focused more on rules, less on rules, and they're back to rules at this point, I think, for the most part. But the move to monetary rules was proceeding well until the pandemic hit. Then rules were out, but then they put them back in. And these are actually stipulations in the monetary policy report of the Fed. And so they put them out again in February of 2022. And Powell there was complaints from the Congress about this. He said, I'll put them back in. And he did put them back in, and they're in now. But there was only small changes in policy, at least from the point of view compared to a rule. We still have an interest rate that's below 3% when it should be higher according to the rule. So in my sense, we are entering a period of high inflation, continuing, unless sensible monetary policy or actions are taken. Now, many things have occurred, and I'll come back to this. The situation in Ukraine has raised inflation, but it's not the basic story. It's distracting, and people pay attention to this, but that's really not the basic story of what's going on. We have to keep that in mind as we look at the situation. So when we look at the situation, we see this is Jay Powell, some testimony in the Hill, which he's being asked to do a lot. It just is just to summarize this. You can look at the slides later, but there are people who were noting there was a big discrepancy between the policy and the so-called Taylor rule. That's what the members of Congress were stipulating. And he answered Bill Huizinga, don't worry, we'll have it back in the next one. He discussed it with French Hill. We'll bring them back for the July, and he did. He brought them back, but it was part of the system in the United States and in other countries where the monetary policy, there's kibitzing about the policy from different quarters. And this is actually a picture of the rules in the 2022 report just finished. And you can see there are 5 rules listed there. They're all a variant on the so-called Taylor rule, which is almost 30 years old at this point. It says the interest rate, just as I showed you a few minutes ago, should be higher if inflation as it is now. And so that's really what we want to focus on as much as possible. Now, let me just continue. I think it's good that rules are back in the monetary policy report, but they're not yet part of the strategy. I think that's what we have to focus on. And there's rationales for that, and you've heard this. Some of the rationale was the inflation rate was transitory. Don't worry, it was low in previous years. It'll go back again. It was supply chains, ships filling up in the harbor. Ukraine is mentioned. And there have been small changes, but policy rules are not the main factor on what's happening. And so there's thinking about how this is going to adjust, but it's not there yet. So this is the actions of the Fed. They've raised rates. You can see over at the end there, they're most likely to raise rates by another 75 basis points in the next meeting. We'll see if they do. That's what the speculators are saying. But you can see they backed up almost to where they were before the panic began. And so that's in a direction I think is correct, but it's not sufficient by measures such as the Taylor rule. This is the money supply. It's grown tremendously. It's slowed down a little bit. So just take a look at that. It's increased a tremendous amount. That's the main message of this picture. M2 is the measure of the money supply in the United States. And this is the balance sheet. This is how much the Fed has purchased of assets like treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. It's diminishing to some extent and even coming down. And so this particular type of monetary policy seems over for the time being, and so the focus will be more on the interest rate. Now, finally, I think even if you add all this up, you still find the Fed is behind the curve. And we've had meetings about this and discussions about this. But if you just take the monetary policy report, which I've shown you, and you plug in the inflation rate, 4%, you plug in the gap between actual potential GDP minus 2, you assume the target is 2, that's really what it is, a real interest rate of 1, you still get an interest rate of 5%. So even with these situations, the Fed is way behind. And that's why people are saying it's probably going to raise it. I say 5%. We'll see if that does it. But even if we got to 2% by the end of this year, which doesn't look at all likely, you would say 3%. So 3% is still behind. And so that's the sense in which the Fed is still behind. I want to say I'm not the only person saying this. More and more people are saying this. This is a picture of John Hussman. It's a picture, if you look over the far right, you can see that the federal funds rate, FF, implied by the tail rule, is much higher than the actual rate. And that's the difference that people are beginning to worry about. That higher stimulus to the economy is really what I think is behind the high inflation rate. Now, let me say this, it's important to make the adjustment, but I don't think the adjustment is the kind of thing which will be problematic. Clearly, the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, says inflation is our top priority. We need to address it. She doesn't say explicitly a follow-up policy rule, but she did when she was the chair. No surprises. And going back to the international situation, each country should follow its own rule. Countries are not exactly the same, but many of them are off in the same way that the Fed is off at this point. This is a picture of Korea. This is the consumer price index, and you can see that inflation is on its way up at around 6%, and it's just gone up quite a bit. And so that's an indication of this is not just the United States, it's other countries as well. And so there is adjustment that's need to be made, and some is already being made in Korea at this point by Governor Ri. And then this is other countries. This is Latin America, Eurozone. Look over on the right, and the UK. Up. Inflation rate is rising throughout. It's around 6% there for the UK and the Eurozone, Latin America. So it's not just Asia by any means, and it's not every country in Asia, but it's the same story. I recently served on a committee called, for some reason, the Eminent Persons Group, and we argued there should be a more rules-based policy for countries. They got off of this, and we had the report that indicated this, but it was a global committee, and it emphasized a more rules-based policy. It's hard to disagree that a more rules-based policy is not the right way to go as much as you can. And so the question as we look into the future is, are we going to continue with this situation of high inflation and the damage that could cause? Because we've seen in the past that could cause damage. And the answer is yes, unless policymakers make a change on the monetary side. And I think there are reasons for central banks to use these rules. They're not rocket science, but they come a lot closer. And if the central banks use known rules, and this Taylor rule or things like it are well known, then the interest rate would have to rise if inflation rises as it is now. Now, of course, all rules are contingent. If inflation comes down, we're okay, and it would reduce damaging changes later. Now, let me just finish. I know I'm just about out of time, but there are barriers, and I'll just indicate these are the barriers that have been emphasized in Korea. I'm very pleased by the president of Korea emphasizing Milton Friedman influenced him. I noticed that, but the inflation rate is now 6% in Korea. There's actions taken, but there needs to be more. And I think the idea is a super compensation. You can do it. It can be done. It can be done in a good policy way. And the bottom line is I chose the title to choose economic freedom and prosperity. So let me finish there, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. We're running out of time, but I have just one question related to your PPT slides. You presented the 5 policy rules from the 2022 Monetary Policy Report, and I noticed that you were using the long-run unemployment rate variable as a proxy for potential GDP growth. I guess you adopted the Okun's law, which it presents the empirical relationship between the long-run unemployment rate and the potential GDP growth. Wasn't that right?
Well, Oken's law works pretty well, but you have to be careful when you use it. But it was, yes, used to some extent. When unemployment is very low, it's really a symptom that the economy is doing well. It's not a one-for-one relationship, but it's pretty close. So it's a good observation that you're making.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.